The memory of losing thunder still haunted Marcus's dreams. It happened during what should have been a routine patrol along the border settlements, a milk run to show Roman presence and collect tribute from villages that had sworn allegiance to the empire. Marcus had been leading 20 men through territory that maps marked as pacified, territory where Roman eagles flew from every watchtower, and children learned Latin alongside their tribal languages. The attack came from nowhere. 50 Cherusci warriors emerged from concealment with war cries that turned the peaceful morning into chaos and blood. But these weren't desperate tribesmen making a last stand for their ancestral lands. These were professional raiders, organized and equipped better than many Roman auxiliary units. They moved with coordination that spoke of training, planning, and leadership that understood Roman tactics well enough to counter them effectively. Marcus's sentry fought back with discipline that would have made their drill instructors proud, forming a defensive square that used shields and spears to create a killing zone around their position. But the raiders weren't interested in a fair fight. They'd come for specific targets, and thunder was at the top of their list. "The Black Horse," their leader had shouted in accented Latin that revealed education beyond what most barbarians possessed. "Take the Black Horse alive." The coordinated assault on Thunder's position proved this wasn't random opportunity, but planned theft. While half the raiders engaged Marcus's soldiers in fierce combat, the other half worked systematically to separate Thunder from his rider, using nets, ropes, and tactics clearly designed by someone who understood how war horses fought alongside their human partners. Thunder's resistance was magnificent and heartbreaking. The stallion struck down 3 warriors with hooves that crushed skulls like eggshells, but eventually numbers and preparation overcame even his extraordinary courage. Marcus watched helplessly as nets tangled Thunder's legs, while drugged darts struck his neck, bringing the mighty warhorse down like a felled tree. "Marcus!" Gaius had grabbed his arm as he prepared to fight his way through 20 enemies to reach his fallen mount. "They'll kill you before you take 10 steps. Then I die with him!" But Thunder, even as consciousness faded from drug-tipped darts, had looked directly at Marcus with eyes that seemed to say, "Live, find me, I'll wait."
The black stallion's hoofprints ended at the river. 3 years ago, those tracks had led Centurion Marcus Aurelius through half of Gaul, across mountain passes where wolves howled at midnight, and into villages where locals crossed themselves when they heard Thunder's name. Now, standing on the same muddy riverbank where his search had gone cold, Marcus felt the familiar ache in his chest that came with remembering his greatest failure. Thunder wasn't just missing. Thunder was everything. "Still coming here?" Gaius emerged from the morning mist, his centurion's cloak dripping with dew. 20 years of friendship meant he didn't need to ask why Marcus rode out to this cursed spot every month. "Brother, it's been 3 years. Thunder's either dead or so far from Roman territory that—" "He's alive!" Marcus's voice cut through the dawn air like a gladius through flesh. "I can feel it!" Gaius had heard this conversation before. Every month for 36 months, Marcus made the same pilgrimage to the place where Thunder's trail disappeared. Every month, he returned to their legion camp with the same haunted expression, the same stubborn certainty that his warhorse lived somewhere beyond the mist and forest that stretched endlessly north of the Rhine. The other soldiers whispered about their centurion's obsession. Some called it madness. Others, more generously, called it loyalty. But none of them understood what thunder had meant to Marcus, because none of them had been there the day everything changed. It started during the campaign against the Cherusci tribes, when thunder saved Marcus's life by sensing an ambush that would have killed 30 Roman soldiers. The black stallion's ears had flattened against his skull just moments before painted warriors emerged from the underbrush, giving Marcus enough warning to signal the retreat that kept his century alive. That night, sharing rations around a dying campfire, Marcus had looked into Thunder's intelligent dark eyes and seen something that transcended the normal bond between soldier and mount. Thunder understood warfare like a human, better than most humans. The horse could read terrain, anticipate enemy movements, and most remarkably, seemed to genuinely care about protecting the men who served under Marcus's command. During the siege of a Cherusci stronghold, Thunder carried wounded soldiers to safety one by one, returning to the battlefield again and again until every Roman was accounted for. When the final assault began, the stallion fought beside the infantry like a four-legged legionnaire, striking down enemies with hooves that hit like war hammers.
The search that consumed the next 3 years revealed a level of determination that amazed Marcus's superiors and worried his friends. Using every favor he'd accumulated during 15 years of military service, Marcus organized tracking expeditions that followed Thunder's trail through territories where Roman authority existed more in theory than practice. He learned Cherusci dialects, studied tribal customs, and developed a network of informants who traded information for Roman silver. The investigation revealed that Thunder's theft was part of a larger operation targeting Roman military assets. The raiders who took him worked for Arminius, a Cherusci nobleman who'd served in Roman auxiliary units before betraying his oath to become a resistance leader. Arminius understood Roman military advantages well enough to know that superior cavalry often determined battle outcomes, and he'd been systematically capturing or killing the finest horses in Germanic service. But Thunder was special even among war horses. Word of his intelligence and combat ability had spread through barbarian networks until he became a prize worth extraordinary risks. Arminius wanted Thunder not just for his military value, but as a symbol, proof that Germanic warriors could take anything from their Roman oppressors, even the horses that carried centurions into battle. The trail led through dense forests where Roman columns couldn't follow, across rivers that marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness, and into mountain territories that maps labeled with warnings about hostile tribes and dangerous wildlife. Marcus's tracking parties found evidence of Thunder's passage, hoofprints that matched his distinctive gait, broken branches at heights that indicated his unusual size, and reports from village elders who remembered seeing a magnificent black stallion carried north by warriors singing victory songs. But after 3 months of pursuit,
The trail went cold at this very river crossing where hundreds of horses had passed, creating a confusion of tracks that even experienced scouts couldn't untangle. Marcus spent weeks examining every hoofprint, measuring every stride pattern, and questioning every local resident who might have witnessed something useful. Nothing. Thunder had vanished into the vast wilderness beyond Roman reach, leaving only memories and an obsession that consumed his riders' waking thoughts.
Today felt different, though Marcus couldn't explain why. The morning mist carried scents that reminded him of Thunder's presence, and twice he'd caught himself turning towards sounds that could have been familiar hoofbeats. Superstitious nonsense, he told himself. 3 years of grief and guilt had taught him not to trust hope. Then Claudia Maxima appeared through the forest like an answer to prayers he'd stopped making. Centurion Marcus. The Roman horse breeder's voice carried excitement that made his heart race despite his efforts to maintain emotional control. "I've been searching for you all morning. There's news. News about a black stallion that matches Thunder's description." Marcus grabbed her shoulders with hands that shook despite 15 years of military discipline. "Where? What have you heard?" "There's a black stallion with a white blaze working at the Cherussi horse market. The locals say he's the finest war horse they've ever seen, but no one can ride him. He fights anyone who approaches, except," she paused dramatically, "except when they speak Latin. Then he becomes calm, almost like he's listening for specific words." The description hit Marcus like a cavalry charge. Thunder's distinctive white star, his unusual size, his intelligence that made him respond differently to familiar languages. Every detail matched perfectly with the horse he'd lost 3 years ago. "How big? What markings? Did you see him yourself?" 6 hands taller than normal war horses. Black coat without any brown or gray. White star on his forehead shaped like a lightning bolt. And Marcus, Claudia's voice dropped to a whisper, "He has scars on his left flank that looked like old spear wounds." Thunder's scars. The marks left by Gothic raiders during a battle 2 years before his capture. Wounds that Marcus had treated personally with salves and bandages, while Thunder stood patient as a statue, despite pain that would have driven lesser horses mad. Where is this market? 3 days north of here, in territory that changes hands depending on which tribes are feuding. Dangerous for Romans, but Claudia met his eyes with understanding that came from someone who'd also loved horses enough to risk everything for them. But not impossible for a centurion crazy enough to try.
Marcus was already planning the mission before Claudia finished speaking. 3 days to reach Germanic territory, unknown time to locate and identify the stallion, and the complicated challenge of recovering stolen property from people who considered Romans their enemies. The mission would violate military regulations about operating beyond established borders, risk his career, and possibly get him killed in barbarian territory. He didn't hesitate for a single heartbeat. "Gaius! Marcus's shout brought his friend running from the riverbank where he'd been tactfully waiting during the conversation with Claudia. "We're going north. Pack for a week's journey into hostile territory." "Brother, you can't be serious. One unconfirmed report about a black horse doesn't justify." "It's him. 3 years of searching, and I know it's him. Thunder's alive, Gaius. He's been waiting for me." The preparations that followed moved with the efficiency of soldiers who'd worked together for 2 decades. Emergency supplies, weapons suitable for covert operations, civilian clothes that would help them blend into frontier territories where Roman uniforms attracted fatal attention, and most importantly, enough gold to purchase a horse if negotiation proved possible. But Marcus knew that negotiation was the least likely outcome. Thunder represented too much value, military, symbolic, and personal, for Germanic raiders to surrender him willingly. This mission would probably require theft, violence, or both. As they rode north from the river where Thunder's trail had gone cold 3 years earlier, Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten during the endless months of futile searching: hope. Not the desperate hope that had sustained him through countless failed expeditions, but the calm certainty of a soldier who finally knew where his enemy was located and how to reach him. Thunder was waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, and Marcus was finally going to bring him home. But what Marcus didn't know was that the reunion he dreamed of for 3 years would trigger events that would test their bond in ways that neither man nor horse could possibly anticipate, and that the greatest challenges of their partnership still lay ahead.
The Germanic horse market exceeded every nightmare Marcus had imagined during their 3-day journey north. What Claudia had described as a simple trading post revealed itself as a massive operation that sprawled across natural amphitheater, where hundreds of animals filled temporary corrals, while potential buyers evaluated bloodlines that rivaled anything in Roman cavalry service. But none of that mattered when Marcus saw Thunder. The stallion stood in a reinforced corral at the market's center, surrounded by Germanic horse handlers who clearly respected and feared him in equal measure. 3 years of captivity had changed Thunder's appearance, adding muscle mass and scars that spoke of hard use and abuse. But the basic magnificence remained unmistakable. The powerful hindquarters that could launch him over obstacles other horses couldn't attempt, the intelligent head that turned at sounds too faint for human hearing, and most conclusively, the lightning bolt star on his forehead that Marcus had traced with his fingers countless times during quiet moments between battles. "That's him," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking with 3 years of accumulated grief and desperate hope. "That's Thunder." Thunder's condition revealed the brutal reality of his captivity. Fresh whip marks crossed his flanks, while bite wounds from spurs showed how handlers had tried to break his spirit through pain and intimidation. But his eyes still held the intelligence that had made him Marcus's partner, rather than merely his mount, and when he moved, it was with the fluid grace that had carried them through 100 battles. "Magnificent animal," commented the market overseer, noticing Marcus's obvious interest, "but completely unrideable. We've had him 3 years, and no one has stayed on his back longer than a few heartbeats. He'll fight to the death before he accepts a master." The words hit Marcus like physical blows as he realized what they meant.
For 3 years, Thunder had been refusing to bond with new riders, maintaining loyalty to a partnership that everyone else assumed was finished forever. Despite captivity, abuse, and systematic attempts to break his spirit, Thunder had never surrendered the connection that bound him to the Centurion who'd earned his trust through respect rather than domination. Several men around the corral bore fresh injuries, bite marks, bruises from kicks, and bandage wounds that testified to Thunder's continued resistance. The Germanic handlers spoke of him with the grudging admiration that professional horsemen reserved for animals whose courage they couldn't help but respect, even when it frustrated their efforts to profit from his abilities. "We've tried everything," the overseer continued with obvious frustration. "Different riders, different techniques, even bringing mares to calm him. Nothing works. He fights like a demon possessed, and afterward he stands there watching us with those eyes that seem almost human in their hatred." But Marcus knew that what the Germans interpreted as hatred was actually hope. Thunder's refusal to accept replacement for the partnership that had defined his existence. His stubborn faith that Marcus would eventually come for him despite the passage of time that must have tested even his remarkable loyalty.
The moment of recognition came when Marcus spoke Thunder's name. "Thunder!" he called softly, using the tone that had always calmed the stallion during their years together. "Thunder boy!" The stallion's reaction shattered the morning air like a thunderclap. Thunder's head snapped up, his ears pricked forward, and he released a call that carried across the entire market with such force that conversation stopped and other horses began answering in sympathy. The sound spoke of recognition, joy, and 3 years of waiting that had finally ended. Thunder reared on his hind legs, not in aggression, but in pure excitement, pawing the air while releasing another call that made several nearby horses whinny in response. When his front hooves touched earth again, he began pacing along the corral fence with movements that spoke of barely controlled eagerness to close the distance between them. "Impossible," breathed the market overseer, staring at Thunder's transformation from hostile prisoner to eager partner. "That animal has injured 12 men in the past month alone. He fights anyone who approaches his fence." But Thunder wasn't fighting now. The stallion pressed his massive head against the wooden rails, stretching his neck toward Marcus with obvious desperation to bridge the gap that had separated them for 3 years. The handlers, who normally kept spectators at safe distances, found themselves backing away from an animal whose entire demeanor had transformed from hostile prisoner to devoted companion. The crowd that gathered around the corral grew larger as word spread through the market that something unprecedented was occurring. Germanic horse traders, Roman merchants disguised as buyers, and tribal warriors all pressed closer to witness Thunder's extraordinary reaction to the stranger who'd somehow triggered such a dramatic change in the market's most dangerous animal.
Marcus approached the fence slowly, his hand extended palm up in the gesture that had always calmed Thunder during their years together. The stallion's nostrils flared as he caught his rider's scent, and the soft nickering that followed brought tears to Marcus's eyes despite his efforts to maintain the emotional control that had sustained him through 15 years of military service. "Easy, boy," Marcus murmured, using the tone that had soothed thunder through thunderstorms, battle wounds, and the exhaustion that followed long campaigns. "I'm here. I found you." Thunder's response proved that some bonds transcend time, distance, and the deliberate cruelty of those who profit from separation. The stallion gentled his great head into Marcus's palm with the trust of a creature who had never forgotten the touch of the only human he'd ever chosen to serve. Despite 3 years of captivity, abuse, and attempts to break his spirit, Thunder's loyalty had remained absolute. "You know this horse." The overseer's statement carried undertones that made Gaius shift closer to Marcus, hand resting casually on his concealed gladius. "This isn't chance encounter, Roman." The accusation hung in the air while Germanic warriors began gathering around the corral with expressions that promised violence if they didn't like the answers they received. Marcus realized that his disguise as a horse trader had just become deadly liability. These men weren't stupid, and Thunder's obvious recognition made it clear that their relationship predated any legitimate business transaction.
"That horse was stolen from me 3 years ago," Marcus said, abandoning pretense in favor of truth that might be his only chance of surviving the next few minutes. "I've been searching for him ever since." The laughter that erupted from the gathered Germans carried notes of disbelief and growing hostility. "You expect us to believe that you traveled into Cherussi territory alone to reclaim a single horse?" The overseer's hand moved to his weapon with deliberate menace. "No Roman values any animal that highly." But Thunder chose that moment to demonstrate exactly how valuable he was to the man he'd served in battle. The stallion's ears flattened against his skull as he registered the threatening tone directed at Marcus, and his entire body tensed with the aggressive posture that had terrified Germanic warriors during their years of warfare against Roman cavalry. "Watch him," Marcus said quietly. "Watch how he reacts when you threaten me." Thunder's response proved more eloquent than any words Marcus could have chosen. The stallion began pawing the ground with hoofs that had crushed enemy skulls, his eyes fixed on the overseer with intelligent malevolence that promised swift and painful death to anyone who harmed his human partner. The transformation from gentle reunion to protective fury happened so quickly that several Germans stepped backward instinctively. "He's not just a horse," Marcus said, with authority as one who had commanded men in life or death situations. "He's a war horse, trained for battle, bred for intelligence, and loyal beyond anything your people have ever seen. That's why your warriors stole him. That's why no one can ride him. And that's why I'll pay any price you ask to take him home." The offer of payment shifted the atmosphere from potential violence toward commercial negotiation, though the overseer's expression remained skeptical. "Even if your story is true, this animal is worth more than any individual could afford. His bloodline alone represents generations of breeding excellence. Name your price."
The transaction that followed represented more than simple commerce. It was the resolution of a quest that had consumed 3 years of Marcus's life and tested his sanity in ways that war never had. As he counted out gold that represented his entire savings, plus emergency funds borrowed from Gaius, Marcus knew the real challenge lay ahead. 3 years of captivity had changed Thunder in ways that went beyond physical scars. The stallion's spirit had been systematically attacked by handlers who used pain and intimidation to break horses that wouldn't submit voluntarily. While Thunder had never surrendered his loyalty to Marcus, he'd learned to view all other humans as enemies, deserving only mistrust and violence. When Marcus finally entered the corral for their first direct contact in 3 years, Thunder's reaction demonstrated both how much he'd missed his human partner and how much he'd been hurt by others attempting to replace that bond. The stallion approached Marcus with obvious joy, but his movements carried new tensions, ears constantly swiveling to monitor potential threats, muscles coiled for instant defensive action, eyes that tracked every Germanic observer with predatory focus. The simple act of touching Thunder's neck brought responses that seemed almost human in their complexity: relief, gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like tears in his dark eyes. When Marcus whispered apologies for taking so long to find him, for not being strong enough to protect him when he needed it most, Thunder rested his great head against his Centurion's chest in a gesture of forgiveness that made Marcus's throat tighten with emotions that military training had never taught him to handle. The journey home proved challenging in ways that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Thunder's enthusiasm for reuniting with his human partner was tempered by 3 years of abuse that had left him hypervigilant and aggressive toward anyone except his chosen rider. The stallion would tolerate other humans at distances that ensured his ability to defend himself, but anyone who moved too quickly or approached too closely triggered defensive responses that could easily prove fatal. But gradually, day by day, Thunder began to remember what safety felt like. The healing process built on the foundation of trust that had sustained their original partnership, complicated by trauma that required patience and understanding to overcome. Marcus spent hours each day simply being present with Thunder, offering the kind of consistent companionship that gradually convinced the stallion that peace was possible when his human partner was near. Their return to the Legion camp marked not just the end of Marcus's 3-year quest, but the beginning of Thunder's gradual recovery from systematic abuse. The reunion became legendary throughout their frontier command, inspiring soldiers to value their animal partners more highly while providing hope for anyone who had lost something precious and refused to abandon the search for what had been taken from them. As Thunder regained his confidence and remembered the joy of working with rather than against humans, the bond between Centurion and Stallion emerged stronger than it had been before their separation. Tested by loss and strengthened by reunion, their partnership became proof that some connections transcend any obstacle, survive any test, and emerge triumphant through determination that refuses to accept defeat as final.